Hello, my name's Olurotimi Osha. It's January the 1st, 2026. I'm wishing you a happy new year. I like talking about American presidents, and today I'm going to be talking about um, Vice President Spiro Agnew, who was uh, the vice president to Richard Nixon, our only president who resigned from office. Reason why I'm talking about Spiro Agnew is he's from Maryland. He was from Maryland, and I'd done an earlier video just uh, discussing how Maryland, prior to independence, had been a destination for convicted criminals, making it sort of really a de facto um, semi-penal colony because by the time of independence, about a quarter of the population was actually made up of convicted criminals who were transported from England, Great Britain to work as indentured servants for a period of time. Um, of course, I talked about how I was wrongfully detained by the state of Maryland and false charges were filed against me. So, of course, I'm sort of interested in the criminality, the criminal conduct of Maryland's public officials. Like I've talked about the criminal behavior of Judge James Bonifant, his fraud, and of course, the criminal conduct of the state attorney's office, John McCarthy, the the misconduct of Montgomery County police officers, including one who admitted he wanted to kill me. That's Jeffrey Ray. The falsification of, police reports by Sergeant Charles Drengwitz, who I understand it retired. The falsification of records by Demarcus Coleman. In my interest of the criminal behavior, the criminal conduct of Maryland's public servants, including their law enforcement, their judiciary, their state attorney's office. I think it's pertinent to go into the history of Maryland's connection with criminality. Now, I'm not saying that Marylanders are inherently corrupt. Of course, that would be sort of that would be bigoted, right? Uh, but I want to note that um, racial profiling and linking criminality, crime to minorities, especially Black people, is it's powerful, of course, in America, right? Particularly, you'd see it in Maryland, right? Prior to the false charges against me. Uh, I had never been arrested before in my life, but of course, I used the opportunity for my own sort of investigative journalism when I was wrongfully detained in Montgomery County. And I found that even though Montgomery County is majority white, by far the majority of the people in detention centers in Montgomery County are blacks, right? And of course, um, it got me interested. And by the way, again, racial. So you see that there's a pattern of racial profiling. Now there are people who did studies in the past and pseudoscientific studies who link um, uh, crime, criminal behavior um, with race, ethnicity, biological factors, instead of looking to other factors such as systemic racism or the environment or bad policies that are actually targeting minorities. An example of people who've done such racist studies, they're especially prevalent in the 19th century, was a guy called Cesare Lombroso, and he linked criminal behavior with with evolutionary, traits in humans. Of course, again, as I said, these are examples of racist dogma, including social Darwinism, which is actually practiced. I worked in a firm, a nonprofit at one time, and some of the officers were discussing outright social Darwinism, which they believed in. We're talking about survival of the fittest and things like that. So these um, racist ideas called pseudoscience, linking crime with races, ethnic groups, and biological traits. They've been going on in America, and in fact, there's a field called criminology, right? It's biosocial sociological or biocriminology, biosociological criminology or something. So basically, it links genetic factors, biological traits with crime, and it's basically saying that, well, some groups are inherently predisposed to crime, uh, and we see this is permeating these racist dogma, pseudoscientific. Uh, uh, pseudo scientific uh, uh, doctrines. They're filtering into our legal system, our laws. Recently, there's a September 2025 case ruling by the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, called is it Vasquez Perdomo versus Nome, which was greenlighting racial profiling by ICE, by law enforcement, that they can use, race, appearance, language, and expert scholars, think that this is creating a pathway for the government to legalizing racial profiling in America. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? So we already exist in an environment where marginalized communities, especially blacks, are targeted and racially profiled, and there are arbitrary connections by the government. The government makes arbitrary connections between race and uh, and crime, even though this is illegal under the 14th Amendment. It violates equal protection of the law and other, anti-discriminatory laws and acts of Congress, including the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So it's illegal to profile racially, but it exists. It happens. I don't believe that crime is inherent or specific to any race or group of people. I don't think, that's not my belief. I'm a Christian, one for one. And in the Bible, it tells us that, that the heart of man desperately, it doesn't say the heart of a black man or the heart of a Jewish person or the heart of a white person or the heart of a Scottish person or the heart of an English person is desperately wicked. It says the heart of man is desperately wicked, devising every cruel thing. So um, crime, just as a human mankind, we're connected biologically, genetically. You can find the traits, genetic markers of every trait of every race, right? So of course, race being a social construct. We can find genetic markers of black people in white people, of white people in Asians, and it goes on like that. So everyone is predisposed or not predisposed to crime. But just as an exercise, like I said, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And it's just, um, I'm just doing a history and analysis of, Maryland's connection to crime and, their public servants and politicians' connection to crime. Especially it's pertinent considering Maryland charged me with false charges. I'm here in Maryland, and so I'm doing an analysis of their criminal public servants like Judge James Bonifant of Montgomery County Circuit Court, and the state attorney's office run by John McCarthy and a disturbed Assistant State Attorney Thea Zumwalt. And of course, there's a new one, John David Lalos, or whatever his name is. And of course, the crooked cops, Sergeant Charles Drengwitz and Demarcus Coleman, the corrupt, uh, crooked cops. By the way, Maryland is part of the Beltway, so the Beltway corruption is it's proverbial in the United States. That's because the Beltway uh, is synonymous with the federal government, right? The capital, and it links, the criminal conduct of many politicians, especially bureaucrats, with bribery, contracts, um, and influence peddling, lobbying, um, and it's and because of that, its public servants are notoriously linked with bribery scandals, and that it just goes on in the community. So I'm going to talk about uh, President Nixon, who had to resign because of corruption as well. In his case, obstruction of justice and other things. Other things would come out later on, but uh, Nixon was um, Nixon had a long history, right? Of he had to be defending himself when he was running as vice president to President David Eisenhower, who didn't really like him, by the way. But he had to defend himself. He went on this televised, on television, and he gave a speech talking about how he was not a corrupt guy, and he was frugal. He didn't own any money. Of course, this uh, what happened, and later on, what happened was, in 1960 as well, when he was running for president against John F. Kennedy, there's a journalist by the name of Jack Anderson who uh, published um, an article that the richest man in America then, or one of the richest, Howard Hughes. Of course, Howard Hughes was the subject of the Leonardo DiCaprio movie, The Aviator, right? So Howard Hughes uh, it was disclosed that Howard Hughes had given Nixon's brother uh, Donald Nixon, over $200,000, a loan, which had turned out to be a gift because he never repaid it, right? It's over $200,000. So you're giving a major politician, that's a billionaire, giving a major politician's brother, a gift of over $200,000 for what? So Jack Anderson published this, and Nixon always had this enmity against him, believing that he was the reason why he lost the presidency to John Kennedy, because he published that article in 1960 on the eve of the elections. So when Nixon was president, uh, it was it was said that Gordon Libby, who was an FBI guy, and a guy called Howard Hunt, who was a CIA guy. By the way, these two men were brilliant, right? They were supposed to have planned a way to assassinate Jack Anderson, and they were going to use drugging by spiking his car, the steering wheel of his car, with LSD, or kill him through a mugging, a staged mugging. These came out. These were exposed during the Watergate scandal, because the assassination, it did not occur. The assassination attempt did not occur because the men who were involved with the who were supposed to be involved, who were supposed to orchestrate the assassination of the journalist Jack Anderson, were the same guys who were involved in the Watergate scandal, and of course they were apprehended. And that's Gordon Liddy, and Howard Hunt. And it was said that it was this guy called Chuck Colson, who was a White House counsel, who had ordered the assassination, right, for the benefit of Richard Nixon. We don't know if Richard Nixon ever authorized it or ever knew of it, but It turned out that there was this group called the Plumbers, right? It was a secret White House group unit called the Plumbers, and they acted under the instructions of the president, you know, to do certain illegal activities. And so, one other thing that happened was, apart from they're burglarizing the Watergate building, which was the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee, right? And they were caught in trying to, burglarize. They were trying to put, uh, hearing, eavesdropping devices, and they were caught breaking and entering, and this was exposed, and it became the Watergate scandal. Now, Richard Nixon was said to have tried to distance himself, and it was revealed that he paid some hush money, right, to silence the burglars. That's the 5 men who were caught burglarizing the Watergate building. So they didn't connect the scandal. They didn't connect the incident with the White House, and of course, Richard Nixon had lied to the American public, saying, he had nothing to do with it. And it turned out that he had actually used the CIA to obstruct FBI investigation into the Watergate scandal. Now, one other thing that he had also done was he'd used these men to also burglarize the office of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist, to try and get incriminating, material that would discredit him. Daniel Ellsberg was a former U.S. Marine, brilliant guy who had a PhD. He had worked as an analyst. He had worked for the Rand Corporation, and he released the Pentagon Papers. So he was charged with, under the Espionage Act, but eventually these were dismissed because of the government misconduct and evidence tampering. What they'd done, those were illegal. Uh, uh, they were illegal government conduct, right? It's government misconduct when government is trying to harass a witness, a potential witness tampering, plant evidence, and things like that. So that's government misconduct. I did an earlier video and talking about Fourth Amendment violations, right? Um, in the Olmsted versus United States, which was overturned by Katz versus United States, right? The government cannot gather evidence against a target in using illegal means, right? Like illegal wiretapping without a warrant. And so it was found out that Nixon was involved in all these dirty dealings. And uh, the activities of Richard Nixon overshadowed the corruption of the Maryland man, Spiro Agnew, who was his vice president. So Spiro Agnew was forced to resign due to his own corruption scandal, and he pled no contest. So it was when Spiro Agnew, who was a former governor of Maryland, when he resigned, um, Richard Nixon then picked uh, Gerald Ford as his vice president. Gerald Ford had been in Congress, and Richard Nixon picked Gerald Ford because it was supposed to be a man above board who had dignity. And so eventually Nixon himself resigned, and Gerald Ford became president and pardoned him. He decided not to prosecute him. And of course, that went on to be called a corrupt bargain, one of the three corrupt bargains, at least three corrupt bargains in U.S. presidential annals. So it's interesting that Gerald Ford is the only American president that was never elected into office. Of course, everybody else is elected on a ticket, on a presidential ticket. So Gerald Ford is the only U.S. president who was never elected, right? And who became president. He was never elected as vice president. He never ran on a ticket as vice president, and he was just picked, appointed after Spiro Agnew resigned. Now, why did Spiro Agnew, who was from Maryland, he had been Maryland's governor, Why did he resign? Because Spiro Agnew, he pled no contest to tax evasion. It turns out the government was also charging him with bribery and extortion, right? So you see, Maryland has that infamous link, for it's Beltway corruption, right? So Maryland is right there, the Beltway. It's Maryland, DC, Virginia, and just because of the huge companies that get contracts from the government, there's a lot of bribery that goes on, influence peddling, lobbying. These things are illegal; they're crimes. Now, again, that's not to make it seem like Maryland is the only culprit in the government's corruption and scandals. No, and neither was Richard Nixon the only person involved in um involved in corruption scandals. He's the only one who resigned. He's the only one who resigned. Prior to him, President James Garfield had actually been implicated while he was congressman in a corruption scandal. And of course, this had to do with a construction company called Credit Mobilier, which was created by Union Pacific Railroad, Union Pacific Railroad Company. Um, so this was during the development of the transcontinental railroads, and of course, this was during the U.S. Civil War. A lot of land grants and bonds were given by the U.S. government to facilitate the development of the railroads and, of course, the telegraphs as well. And so James Garfield had been a congressman then, and uh, by the way, my source for this is a book I read while wrongfully detained. It's very interesting if you could read it. It's called Nothing Like It: The Men Who Built the Railroads. Um, I think from 1863 to 1869. It's a very interesting book written by Stephen E. Ambrose. And of course, I had read the autobiography of Richard Nixon's memoirs. But this book, Nothing Like It in the World, it's by Stephen E. Ambrose. It talks about how the Credit Mobilier Company, uh, with the involvement of Union Pacific Railroads, they charged inflated amounts for the building of the railroads, and they bribed public officials, including congressmen, not to prevent investigations, right, and to allow the continued payment of the U.S. government for the building of the inflated uh, costs for build for the to continue to pay the inflated cost for the building of the U.S. railroads. And so, amongst the men that was implicated was Congressman James Garfield. James Garfield is the only U.S. president who uh, was elected president while he was an incumbent congressman. So, James Garfield, of course, James Garfield went on to be assassinated. Now, James Garfield, of course, was cleared. Nothing came out of these investigations. So the Congress started to investigate to see, uh, the issue, to investigate the credibility of the bribery scandals, right, regarding Credit Mobilier. Um, it was said that this guy, a congressman, Oaks Ames from Massachusetts, uh, had facilitated the transfer of shares of this company to U.S. congressmen, including James Garfield. And of course, James Garfield, the president, is not the only person who was implicated. He went on to become president of the United States. He was elected president subsequently. But the scandal happened when he was congressman. So you see, it didn't really affect his career. Now, we had a vice president as well. And so Spiro Agnew of Maryland was not the only person who was implicated. He's not the only vice president who's been involved with corruption. There was Vice President Schuyler Colfax, who was the vice president of President Ulysses S. Grant. This he also was implicated in the uh, the corrupt transfer of Credit Mobilier shares to a congressman in order to, facilitate the inflation of the amounts that the government paid for the building of the railroads and to prevent an investigation. So that's a vice president. He became vice president to Ulysses Grant, and his name was Vice President Schuyler Colfax. And that's not to say that Maryland, the state of Maryland, is the only one that's sort of involved in the Beltway corruption. Schuyler Colfax was born in uh, New York, and he was a congressman representing Indiana at the time. And James Garfield himself was an Ohio man, so they were not from Maryland. So that's not to say that Maryland is inherently just corrupt, and it's the only one that's implicated in the Beltway corruption of the of federal government politicians. Um, yeah, uh, so it's kind of interesting, and considering that these people who were implicated were very brilliant people. So that's not to also say, I've been pointing out how, the crooked cops in Maryland, including Demarcus Coleman, uh, seem to be semi-literate. They could barely write their falsified incident and police reports. So that's not to say only unintelligent people or uneducated people or undereducated people are crooked, are corrupt. Of course, these people are corrupt, and I'm hoping this will be proven through courts of laws. I've filed complaints against them. Internal Affairs, the FBI refers it to Internal Affairs Division. Internal Affairs Division is basically the police department investigating itself, right? So it's sort of a rubber stamp body, and they never do their job, so they just release these boilerplate letters, right? So in any event, these politicians that I've discussed were all very intelligent men. Richard Nixon himself was a very intelligent president. It's funny that his IQ is never pegged at like amongst the highest. It's pegged as high, right? But like in the middle of American presidents. Our presidents have had, according to historiometrics, of course, a very high intelligence. Even the people who are, uh, have the lowest IQs amongst our president through historiometrics, they're guesstimated as having still uh, to be highly intelligent, right? Of course, some like whoa, genius level intelligent, way more intelligent than others, like John Quincy Adams, who is estimated to have 175 IQ by historiometrics. But Nixon, I guess because of his infamy, right, and because he had to resign, I think I think it works against him. When they're doing the historiometrical IQ measurements, I think they normally factor in his notoriety from the Watergate scandal, which led to his resignation. If not, Richard Nixon was a very highly intelligent man. He was admitted to Harvard, but he didn't go to Harvard. It was known he was admitted to Harvard University, but he didn't go because his family couldn't afford, to support him there. He couldn't get the full scholarship he needed. Back then, he had to pay money. And of course, he was from California, so he went to another school and he graduated all the time. He graduated in the top three uh, of his class. He went to Duke Law School. I think he graduated second or third. And when I read his memoirs, he claimed he would have been first, but he fell sick on the day of the exam or something like that. So he was very intelligent. Uh, but even Richard Nixon, everybody talks about how Bill Clinton was a saxophonist, right? How he played a musical instrument very well. Nobody points out that Richard Nixon could actually play five uh, musical instruments very well, and he was never formally trained right, to read music. He played the saxophone excellently. He played the piano excellently. He played the clarinet, the accordion, the violin, right? He played five musical instruments excellently. Nobody points these things out. So he was a very intelligent man. It's unfortunate that he was linked, connected with crime, criminal behavior while in office, and he actually advanced criminal conduct. And he was a lawyer. Now, Spiro Agnew himself was a lawyer, and he pled no contest. He resigned, and he was disbarred. So when he pled no contest, that meant he was pleading guilty, sort of to a felony, right? And so he got 3 years probation, and he paid a fine. I think it was a $10,000 fine, and he was disbarred as a lawyer. So and of course, because he took the plea bargain of no contest. He was not charged with the bribery and extortion and conspiracy charges. So he pled no contest to which is sort of a felonious conviction, to the tax evasion. You know, so that's Maryland for you, and the connection uh, with public servants, Maryland's Beltway corruption, its connection with crooked public servants. And as I was talking about how intelligent these people were, Spiro Agnew was an intelligent man as well. Even Gordon Libby. Gordon Libby was a lawyer himself, the FBI agent. He'd had a stellar record. And Howard Hunt. Howard Hunt was a CIA guy. He graduated from an Ivy League, graduated from Brown University. So these were intelligent men. Chuck Colson was a lawyer himself. He graduated from my law school, George Washington University Law School. So it's astonishing that they were abusing power. Of course, abuse of power was one of the things that Nixon was going to be impeached for. When they were investigating him, he abused his power. He used government agencies to target and harass his political enemies, including the FBI and CIA. He used the CIA to block the FBI investigation uh, into the Watergate scandal and other things. Eventually, Gordon Libby and Howard Hunt, they did go to prison, and Chuck Colson as well. I think they were convicted for conspiracy, burglarizing, and illegal wiretapping. But it's astonishing that they were actually conspiring to assassinate someone, to kill someone, and I guess that's a reason why the American public does not trust the government agencies regarding the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And people think, they say a good deal of Americans think the government, the CIA, the FBI were involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And of course, it doesn't help things that, what's his name? Uh, Lee Harvey Oswald, the apparent, the suspect who was caught, who was assassinated himself. He was an ex-Marine, right? He was a Marine veteran. So it doesn't help matters. So, yeah, so a reason why I'm discussing again, one reason why I'm doing this discussion on Maryland's connection with crime, it's the Beltway corruption of Maryland and its public officials' corruption association with crime, including Spiro Agnew, who resigned as vice president due to his corruption and charges, is because I had done an earlier video also talking about how Maryland was a destination uh, under the uh, the Felons Act of 1717, uh, which allowed Great Britain to transport its convicted criminals to the state of Maryland, the Chesapeake area. And when they were transported, by the way, you know, the government paid the merchants about £3 back then to transport each one, and they would sell them off at Chesapeake markets, for £10. And so I'm going to do a subsequent video, just comparing the white indentured servants who came from Great Britain and the African slaves, their status. Why is it that if there were white men who worked as slaves, as indentured servants, who were convicted criminals, and they were a significant proportion of the of Maryland and Virginia, about a quarter of them, of the population, were actually indentured servants, white indentured servants. Why is it that we don't hear, uh, them asking their descendants asking for reparations, right? Who were these people? And so that's a reason why I actually wanted to do this little piece, and I'm going to do a subsequent piece on just comparing the white indentured servants and the African slaves. I'll do another video. This video has already gotten long, and yeah. So it's I think I've pretty much covered most of what I wanted to cover regarding Maryland's connection with the with criminality and the Beltway corruption and yeah. My name's Olurotimi Osha. I've talked about how I've been a victim of false charges by corrupt government officials in the state of Maryland to cover up, to obstruct justice and prevent an EEOC complaint I filed in the Department of Defense, and Office of Special Counsel and Inspector General Office's complaints I filed concerning fraud that I found in the Department of Defense and Department of the Navy, and to discredit me. And I've been victimized, I've been maligned, I've been defamed. I was almost killed, I was almost assassinated. I talked about drugging. I was actually drugged. Well, the thing is, we don't know who did the drugging. And so, Maryland corrupt officials, including a corrupt judge, Judge James Bonifant, has covered up and tried to discredit me, and and facilitated the prosecutorial and police misconduct that have that have violated my constitutional rights. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.